This summer could be one for the travel record books, especially with packed airports. And here to talk about the airline industry is Scott Kirby, the CEO of United Airlines. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Well, I first want to talk to you now that we're 3+ years after the pandemic. We're coming out of it. It was a very strange time, obviously challenging time for so many people in industries, including the airlines. What were some of the lessons learned and reflections about it?
Well, I guess one of the lessons would be you can get through almost anything if a team pulls together and works together. If we'd have known the scope of the crisis on day one, I don't think anyone would have thought airlines could have made it through. And here we are, carrying a record number of customers on the other side. Another lesson for me is actually that in a time of uncertainty, it's important to be decisive. I think there was a Teddy Roosevelt quote that said, in a crisis, the best thing to do is make the right decision. The second best thing is to make the wrong decision. The worst thing to do is make no decision. And I think that was pretty true during the crisis.
Well, right now we have a tight labor market. Unemployment rate is very low, but United is planning to hire 15,000 people this year. Can you tell us about your plans and why you're going to be hiring so many people?
Well, United is growing faster than any airline in the history anywhere in the world has done in terms of absolute growth. So we did hire over 15,000 last year. We intend to hire over 15,000 again this year. And at United, we're able to actually hire, we have a couple of 100,000 people that have applied for flight attendant jobs. Because they're great careers, they're really not jobs. They're careers where you can stay for a career, make good wages, support a family, have good benefits. We're able to hire. The challenges for us are more in all the infrastructure that supports aviation, whether it's fuel vendors or TSA or air traffic controllers. All the support infrastructure around aviation is far more challenging for us than actually hiring at United. But we are glad to be hiring at such a rapid pace here at United.
Scott, what are your views on the economy? Obviously inflation is still high. It has come down a little bit. There's a lot of concern. Basically, 4 in 5 people think we are either in a recession or we're going to be heading into one. What's your outlook?
So, I think it's a tale of two economies. And the business investment or selling to businesses portion of the economy is in a recession. And you can see that in the kinds of businesses and how they're reacting. We see in our own data that our business travel is probably 20 to 25% below where we would expect it to be right now. But the flip side of that is that the consumer portion of the economy is very strong, particularly the services side. So I think a lot of what is happening here is we had an economy that over-indexed to hard goods during the pandemic because you couldn't travel, you couldn't go to restaurants, and now it's just rebalancing back to normal. And so if you're selling, hard goods, if you're in the home repair, business, then it feels like a recession. It is a recession because you over-index for a couple of years. And if you're an airline, if you're a cruise company, a hotel, a restaurant, a salon, any of those things, it feels pretty good right now because you're coming back out of the recession. And so I think it's a tale of two economies: business recession, but strong, particularly for services, consumer side of the economy at the same time.
As far as just going back to COVID, are there any issues that are still outstanding, whether that's supply chain issues or United States is doing pretty well on COVID compared to other countries, but obviously you're in a global industry. Are there any outstanding issues that you're like, yeah, we still got a problem here?
Well, I think we've moved into the endemic phase from the pandemic phase of COVID. And so, for example, we have higher sick calls than we had pre-pandemic because there's a new endemic illness called COVID that people still get. And so we have that. And the supply chain, those kinds of issues are still recovering. You look at, I think, air traffic control, not typically called supply chain, but they stopped hiring for a few years. There's a limited number of people that they can hire and train at their single facility in Oklahoma. And then the Transportation Secretary says they're 3,000 controllers short. That's a really big hole to dig out of. When they can train something like 1,500 a year, and they've got something like 1,200 retirements a year. And so getting behind, that's a perfect example of once you get behind, it takes a very long time to dig out of that unless you do something different.
What about changes in the airline industry kind of moving forward with technological advances? Obviously, everyone's talking about AI now. Where is the industry headed in the next 5 to 20 years?
Yeah, well, the aircraft technology, continues to evolve, but the revolutionary portions of aircraft technology are likely going to be supersonic aircraft, which United Airlines was the first airline here in the U.S. to put in an order for supersonic aircraft, the boom supersonic, and then electric aircraft, and what we're doing around sustainable aviation fuel. So there's a lot of work that's happening in those areas. There's also an awful lot of continued progress in improving the customer experience. And I think this is one of the places that generative AI is going to be helpful, and particularly at communicating to customers, and hopefully coming up with better answers for us as well. When there's air traffic control delays or there's weather, how can we use generative AI to come up with better solutions that minimize the number of customers impacted from those kinds of events, but in particular, to do a more effective job of communicating what is complex, but communicating it in more simple terms to customers. And there's a lot of other use cases, but that's one that I'm particularly excited about.
In Washington, as you know, policymakers are grappling with the environment and climate change, and there's a lot of proposals out there. We saw some proposals get enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act. As far as what United is doing on climate change and the environment, can you touch upon that?
Sure. United is the leading global airline around the world in taking real action around climate change. And two big things. One, sustainable aviation fuel. I talked about electric aircraft earlier, but big airplanes flying long distance, there's not even a theoretical battery technology that could power them. They're just too heavy. So we're going to use fuel, but sourcing it from a sustainable source instead of sourcing it from oil is really important in the future. And, we're the leader around the globe. We started an investment fund to invest in the kind of startups that are really building that industry. And then the second important point is we've made a commitment to be 100% green by 2050 at United, which is distinct from others' net zero. And what makes it distinct is we're going to get there without using traditional carbon offsets. And if you want, I can give you a longer speech on traditional carbon offsets, but the short answer is they're mostly not real. They're borderline fraudulent. And even when they are real, they're so small that they can never scale up to make a meaningful difference. And when every company is using that as their way to get to net zero, we're not going to come even close.
I want to go back to kind of the economy, and I know you touched upon this, but I was actually flying United to Savannah this past weekend, and I tell you, the airport was packed, but that also depends on not only supply and demand, but prices. Where do you think prices for airline travel are going this year?
Well, thanks for flying us. I hope it was a good flight.
Yeah, what's that?
Prices are coming back to kind of the levels that they were pre-pandemic. So, in real terms, they're still lower than they were a decade ago, but they had an artificial low during the pandemic that come back to kind of what I would call normal. So my guess is pricing will grow kind of with inflation as we move forward.
Are you concerned, now in Washington we have this raging debt limit fight? Look, there is a bill that's going to move forward, it looks like, but until it's past the finish line, there are a lot of industries are concerned because economists have said if we don't raise the debt ceiling, it could really damage the global economy and could lead to millions of jobs being lost. Are you confident that the Congress can actually get something done here?
Well, a week ago, I was a lot more worried about it, and and actually said on TV that we should avoid an unforced error. We're doing a pretty good job of managing the economy either into a soft landing or a mild recession, but defaulting on the debt would be an unforced error that could have really significant consequences. So I'm really encouraged by what happened over the weekend. On both sides, compromise. Where neither one got everything they want, that's the nature of what the political system would be. And I'd make an even bigger point about it: the fact that they were able to find a compromise. I'm a hopeless optimist, I suppose, but makes me think that perhaps they can use that template to find other places where they can compromise instead of just being opposed to everything that the other side is for.
What do you think that Washington policymakers should know? I know United obviously has people in Washington tracking legislation and regulations and trade association as well. But what is something that you think that policymakers should know, outside the Beltway, maybe frustration with regulators or legislation or anything else like that?
I mean, that's pretty broad. I'd like our government to function more effectively and focus on what's the right thing for the country instead of what's the right thing for politics. There's too much focus on, what does this mean for my parties or my personal election chances, as opposed to what's the right thing for the country. And on a more tactical basis, really important for the aviation industry and for the basic infrastructure for the country to get an FAA reauthorization bill done. We have, in real dollars, the FAA's budget is smaller than it was 20 years ago, and they've been asked to take responsibility for all kinds of new things: space, drones, far more resources dedicated to aircraft certification programs, and they've had to fund that by taking it out of the front line. And there's 3,000 fewer controllers, over 3,000 controllers short. We have fewer air traffic controllers today than we had 30 years ago, and that's not just an issue for airlines. That's not just an issue for our customers. That's also an issue for the economy. I mean, it's a huge contributor to the economy, and we need to get that done and fixed.
You mentioned the FAA reauthorization bill. Reauthorization legislation usually is bipartisan, but sometimes there can be some snags. Are you confident that Congress can work on a bipartisan basis to get it done?
Well, I'm hopeful. And across the board, when I'm up on Capitol Hill, this is one bill that people want to be bipartisan, has a history of being bipartisan, and that people want to be bipartisan. So my fingers are crossed. On most issues, everyone seems to be aligned, and we'll see how it goes. I'm headed there tomorrow.
When you're in contact with policymakers, whether it's the Department of Transportation, I mean, has there been a good communication from this administration? Because obviously there's always going to be airline difficulties, whether that's weather-related or otherwise.
This is one where I think we're pretty aligned on trying to get the appropriate amount of resources for the FAA. Secretary Buttigieg talked about being 3,000 controllers short a week or two ago. The Air Traffic Controllers Union talks about being short. Every single airline talks about it. We see it every single day, day in and day out, the impact of air traffic control shortages. So, it's hard for anyone to be credible and not be aligned with, we need more resources for air traffic control.
Is it, when you're working with other airlines, obviously they're rivals, but you all want a lot of the same things. Is it easy to kind of put, or is it difficult to put your differences aside to say, okay, we need to unite to ask for X, Y, and Z from Washington?
Most of the time we're pretty good on it on things that are an industry level. I'm sometimes there are airlines that can't avoid the temptation to try to do something for themselves. There's one issue that's come up in this one that I hope we can put aside that would be incredibly contentious if it stays on the table. But hopefully we'll be able to put that one aside and focus on what's good for the country, for the infrastructure of the country, and the whole aviation system overall.
I got a last question, but it's a bit broad. So two-parter. Number one, what is the toughest part of your job day to day? And number two, what's the most rewarding part of your job?
Well, I have a great job. So it's fun. I can't imagine having a better job. We have great people here at United. I used to say that we're going to build the biggest and the best airline in the history of aviation. We've now become the largest. We're growing. We're viewed as a leader around the globe in sustainability. We're leading with things like the Aviate Academy of creating opportunity for everyone. People are feeling really good. And so, the best thing for me is probably getting on airplanes or walking through terminals or even walking down the street and an employee or a customer stops me to tell me that, how proud they are of United. And I say that I have the easiest job of anyone at United Airlines because I only have one responsibility, which is to create an airline that our employees are proud of, and they'll take care of everything else. And so when I hear that, and I hear it a lot, I heard it on my flight today from both the pilots and the flight attendants, it makes me feel really good.
I'm sure you keep them on their toes when they know you're on the plane. but that's a very
I think
good
they behave
answer.
normally with me.
Well, Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.